Since the time of the Enlightenment, Western thought has been driven by the belief that it's possible to have a direct and unmediated knowledge of reality, the reality of nature and the reality of our own nature. Progress meant that the application of reason, knowledge of reality, would lead to the conquest of natural and social evils and the emancipation of humanity. In Hegel's phrase, we would be more and more at home in the world. But even its most fervent present-day protagonists, like the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas, agree that this modern project is incomplete. And this is quite a general feeling. For many of us, these are confusing times in which older universal traditions and certainties that seemed, even very recently, to be quite solid and reliable, no longer offer the same security. We still seem far from being at home in the world. And others have come to insist that it's absurd ever to believe that we could be. They argue from a variety of directions, from Wittgenstein's later philosophy, from American philosophical pragmatism, from Nietzsche, that direct knowledge of nature, above all a direct knowledge of our own nature, is inconceivable. We can never connect, we can certainly never know that we connect with the things that there are in the world. All that we can know is what we say about the world, our talk, our sentences, our discourse, our texts. There's nothing outside these texts, no extra texts. There's nothing prior to these texts, no pretexts. There are just more texts. Indeed, this claim itself is just another text. And the mistake in the modern project, these people argue, is not just philosophical. It's also moral and political. By this point in the 20th century, it's clear that too many heads have been broken in the name of too many theories posing as truths. Attempts to control nature and reform society by applications of one or another kind of reason have become increasingly problematic. They've thrown up phenomena that are paradoxical, contradictory, and increasingly difficult to control. The horrors of the modern world, the threat of nuclear annihilation, ecological crises, systematically applied totalitarianisms, are the products of the modern project. Its successor, the postmodern project, is, as so many others have been, pressed to its furthest point in Paris. Since 1968, a group of thinkers there, loosely dubbed Post-Structuralists, Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, Gilles Deleuze, and others, have subjected many of the comfortable assumptions about humanity, knowledge, rationality, and progress to disturbing interrogation. But what's been distinctive about this interrogation is that instead of using science and reason to get to a clearer truth, these writers have viewed the very idea of truth with extreme suspicion, something to be dismantled, deconstructed. They've waged a war of deconstruction against all the grands récits with which we find our way around the world, against all the tall stories we tell ourselves. Scientific rationality, the unification of knowledge, the emancipation of humanity. One leading post-structuralist, Jean-François Lyotard, has argued in his recent book, The Postmodern Condition, that the characteristic of the postmodern age is precisely the loss of credibility in the grand récit of modernity. But are we still to think of political progress? And if we are, does that not require some commitment, some belief still in rationality? Here tonight, to argue about whether post-structuralism offers an intelligible position, and if intelligible, acceptable, and if acceptable, livable, are Gayatri Spivak, a professor of English at the University of Texas, who's translated Derrida's most famous work, and is herself a leading deconstructionist and the author of a forthcoming book on deconstruction, feminism, and Marxism. John Donne, a reader in politics at the University of Cambridge, author of a forthcoming book on the politics of socialism, and a book entitled Western Political Theory in the Face of the Future, in which he questions many of the political ideas by which we live. And Ronald Aronson, professor of the humanities at Wayne State University in Detroit, who in his recent book, The Dialectics of Disaster, asks what can be done in the face of the historical slaughterhouse of the 20th century. Gayatri Spivak, could I ask you first whether the deconstructionist movement is a declaration of war or the celebration of a victory over the grand récit?
I think of it myself as a radical acceptance of vulnerability. The grand récits are great narratives, and a narrative has an end in view. It is a program which tells how social justice is to be achieved. And I think the post-structuralists, if I understand them right, imagine again and again that when a narrative is constructed, something is left out. When an end is defined, other ends are rejected, and one might not know what those ends are. So I think what they are about is asking over and over again, what is it that is left out? Can we know what is left out? We must know the limits of the narratives rather than establish the narratives as solutions for the future, for the arrival of social justice, so that to an extent they're working within an understanding of what they cannot do rather than declaring war.
So if I understand it then, they're not objecting to the very idea of producing narratives. They are, so to speak, dancing critically on the edge of every narrative and counter-narrative that's produced, pointing out the silences, pointing out the unspoken, undescribed others that are implied in each of these narratives. They're not themselves concerned to put a stop to narration itself.
I think what, if one can lump Derrida and Lyotard together in this way, I think what they are noticing is that we cannot but narrate, so that it's not a question of waging war on narratives, but they're realizing that the impulse to narrate is not necessarily a solution to problems in the world. So what they're interested in is looking at the limits of narration, looking at narrativity, making up stories that tell us this is history, or making up stories that tell us this is the program to bring about social justice. They're looking at that in a certain way as symptomatic of the human condition, so that it's not as if they are the solution. We must work with them, but they're also problems. In a narrative, as you proceed along the narrative takes on its own impetus, as it were, so that one begins to see reality as non-narrated. One begins to see the narrative as reality as such. One begins to say that it's not a narrative, it's the way things are.
Could you elaborate on that? I mean, is there some particular narrative that the French deconstructionists and their English and American followers have in mind, which they wish to deconstruct?
Well, the field is fraught. Various kinds of people deconstruct various kinds of things. But it seems to me that the narrative that they are, perhaps all of them agreed upon as the object of investigation, is precisely the narrative that you were talking about to begin with, the rationalist narratives of the knowing subject, full of a certain sort of benevolence toward others, wanting to welcome those others into his own, and I use the pronoun advisedly, into his own understanding of the world, so that they too can be liberated and begin to inhabit a world that is the best of all possible worlds. In the process, what happens is that such a world is defined, and the norm remains the benevolent originator of rationalist philosophy. To an extent, that is, if you like, grosso modo, the object of investigation. But of course, the big word is also phallogocentrism, so that there is a certain sort of understanding that the hero of this scenario, of this narrative, has been, in fact, Western man. So that is something that's also picked up. But that is the count against the Grand Récit, but by no means does it say that over against it is the deconstructive philosopher who destroys. The idea of post-structuralist practice is an acknowledgement that the impulse to narrate, that the impulse to think of origins and ends, that these are things that we all share, but it acknowledges that it is a need rather than the way to truth. So that, I think, it's a very slight difference, but a crucial difference.
It's not entirely clear to me that this gets us very far as argument, but perhaps I'm just using a set of conventional assumptions about what would count as an argument that would stick, which is precisely one of their objects to overthrow, to criticize, to undermine, to subvert in some way.
It really asks for, as it were, to use a very old term, a transformation of consciousness, a change in mindset. It's in that sense, again to use an old-fashioned word, an ideological project, to develop a mindset which allows one not to be nervous about the fact that what one is saying is undermined by the way one says it, radically. Not just make that apology and then business as usual, but actually to present us with that problem, which is the familiar problem of every practice, and say the point is not to produce such an analysis that you will make a nice solution and everything else will be excluded, but to forge a practice which takes this into account.
I see exactly what you mean. Nevertheless, there is a difficulty that business as usual includes trying to establish claims which might be true and to distinguish them from claims which might be false. John Donne, can I ask you what you see the implications of this view to be for truth and falsity?
It's reasonable enough to say that that any characterization of human experience, any statement about what's going on, is necessarily selective, that it in some sense involves editing. But it isn't clear that anything very important follows from that. And I'm not sure that insofar as Western philosophy, particularly since the 17th century, has been directed at attempting to understand the ways in which human capacities for knowing work and fail to work, I'm not sure that there is anything distinctive and clear and true which Western philosophy could draw from post-structuralism myself.
A post-structuralist reader would fix upon what John Donne no doubt thought was simply a rhetorical part of his sentence. I'm not sure that there is anything very important in what is being edited out. But that's precisely the point. That uncertainty is where we would fix our glance. Let us look for a bit at what is being edited out, and then perhaps we shall be able to engage productively what is called affirmative deconstruction with what the nature of that uncertainty is. We don't, in fact, just as I said when you asked me the question about what is the solution, I said let us take into account the structure of our own production. In the same way, I would say let us take into account the rhetorical gestures in what we say. So it is along those lines that I would agree with John Donne, but I would have these particular kinds of questions.
Lord Aronson, I sense that you are not quite at home with this
Let's
view.
come back to the question of editing out various voices from one of the grands récits. I would say Marxism, as one of the, what are referred to as one of the grands récits, edits out certain voices, certain modes of discourse, puts certain ones on the margin, puts others in the center. Now, rather than a great narrative, it seems to me it's an intellectual system which lays claim to truth, which has a structured sense of history, a structured sense of economic life, a structured sense of the fundamental social problems, a structured sense of how all of these operate, unrolling in time, and chooses, therefore, to edit out certain voices to include others because of the very premise on which the whole mode of cognition is built. Now, if one wants to talk within postmodernism of social justice, what basis do you have there within it to speak on behalf of social justice rather, for example, than on behalf of social oppression? In Marxism, it is built into the very mode of cognition, and it's built into Marxism's position allying itself with the oppressed classes. And that's a very clear, what should we say, epistemological and political choice that's made at the beginning. How does one make choices like that?
One makes choices. Once again, I'm trying to speak as much as I can close to the text of the people that we're talking about. One makes choices according to the old rules. There are, again, I'm quoting Derrida, there are no rules but the old rules. But the thing is that Lyotard talking about rules, Derrida talking about rules, they see that those rules are rules, that truth is a matter of validation, and that those things are rules. They are not, they cannot be universalized. And from that point of view, you know, the discourse of Marx may say that it interests itself in social justice, but on the other hand, we know that it is possible to use the very name of Marxism to produce, on occasion, in situations, exactly the opposite.
Certainly, most Marxists, since, at the very least, since Khrushchev's secret speech, and certainly many before, have been aware that Marxism is not an absolute truth, is not a set of rules that are to be followed in every situation, and that indeed it can and has been used as the ideology of a state, as well as the critique of ideology, which is really, I think, its original radical starting point, a radical energy. In some ways, I think it shares with post-structuralism, the effort to, shall we say, get behind the finished social realities, to understand their formation, to understand their roots and their creation in a process of social production, which it turns out is antagonistic and oppressive. There is, however, the Marxist insistence on universalism, which I'd like to emphasize for a moment, not because Marxism is a universal truth as Platonism, as Christianity, but rather that within Marxism, the argument is that capitalism itself and its structures become universalized throughout the world, and that Marxism is an effort to reflect those structures, reflect their operations, and in so doing is trying to present its object. And in as much as capitalism becomes imperialism, becomes displaced in a whole variety of ways, Marxism tries to trace, follow, and remain close to that object, and itself therefore becomes universal truth in as much as these processes are universal, and only that much.
When you're speaking as an Asian Marxist, to an extent, what deconstruction allows us to do is to save Marx from his European provenance because of the critique of the rationalist project even of the 18th century. So that Marxist discourse itself, not the history of Marxism, is made open as a text to the kind of reading that we are proposing.
John Dunn, is it your sense from this conversation about the implications of deconstructionism for Marxism that it leaves political theory more or less where it is?
Well, I still don't understand myself how it can much assist political theory. Marxism has very well advertised limitations as an instrument for political understanding, and it's also, of course, true that although in its formal evaluative commitments it's very firmly committed to human emancipation, that it has actually been very dramatically abused in various political contexts, and of course is still being abused in those contexts in the 20th century. But what's important about it, I think, is its potential contribution as an instrument of political understanding, and I think that its strengths and weaknesses from that point of view are something anyway which can be assessed in terms which certainly descend from the rationalist project of the 18th century, and can be better assessed in those terms than they can by deploying the apparatus of as it were, post-1960s Parisian literary criticism.
Why do you say that? Why do you say it can be better assessed in the older way?
Because what's important for understanding politics is the capacity to analyze in a powerfully simplifying way what really matters that is going on. Because in politics the important thing always is to judge what is at stake, what may and may not happen. And that involves thinking causally. There is no other way in which one could begin to judge about politics than thinking causally. And I do not see that, as it were, a very pronounced suspicion of what other people are saying, which is certainly an entirely appropriate attitude in facing political reality at all times and in all places. I do not see that a very pronounced suspicion of what other people are saying is in itself any contribution at all to powerful and accurate causal judgment.
As I said, we don't throw away we can't throw away thinking causally. But if I can introduce a word that is often used within post-structuralism, it's a word that comes, it's a rhetorical term, but Nietzsche used it in this way, the term metalepsis, that one quite often substitutes an effect for a cause when one is thinking causally. That is a way of being aware that causal thinking also has its own limits. One can't judge without causal thinking, but then to ground the cause that one has established for the analysis into a certainty is what the post-structuralist would question. The post-structuralist would say that generally causes are produced as effects of effects. That's an argument that's perhaps a little complicated, but we can talk about it if you're interested in it.
John, what's your reaction to that?
Well, I think that, I mean, insofar as what post-structuralism is a generalized nervousness about how well one understands what is going on, and it certainly extends to the self-understanding of post-structuralists as well as to the self-understanding of everyone else. I don't see that it could do any harm. I'm not speaking against there being people who practice it. What I am expressing skepticism about is how much help it actually will turn out to be in understanding politically what is going on and what it's a good idea to do. And I think it would be perhaps helpful to lay it on the line from that point of view against other persistent critiques and other radically critical philosophies of practice. And I wonder if I mean, going back to a formula you used at the very beginning, that what it is a radical acceptance of vulnerability. That sounds very attractive, because we certainly are vulnerable, and we better face up to that as bravely as we can. But I think it's worth asking how much better a post-structuralist sensibility is likely to prove at picking out the precise dimensions of our vulnerability, at assessing the range of very direct threats which face us, and at directing us on how we might, in practice, because it is a very practical matter, it's a very heavy world we live in, how we might set about trying to counter those threats.
I don't think in terms of the large programmatic solutions we will be able to produce those kinds of things. The interests of understanding are better served by the narratives, but the narratives are limited, and the narratives, as they save, also kill. And to an extent, post-structuralism reminds us of that as it goes on.
So the bottom line is that it's a generalized encouragement to stay very widely awake as you move through.
I came to the discussion worried about the nuclear threat and worried above all about what one could call a very specific threat, but one which is universal and generalizable. And thinking to myself, what tools do we need in order to grasp and understand this threat, and in order to dismantle it? An act of dismantling which is not an intellectual one, but has to be a political one. I'm not sure what help the orientation you're developing can give in encountering that threat. I can turn to other systems of thought, Marxism, for example, once again, and follow particular structured ways of allowing access to at least some main dimensions of that threat. But it seems to me that given the overwhelming and grand, great traumatic nature of what we face, we need modes of thought which are equal to those threats. And structuralism, post-structuralism, as you present it now, seems very humble. As it presents itself when I read it, it seems, shall we say, far more, to arrogate far more to itself. It seems to make the whole world into a text, as you quoted earlier. It seems to banish any comprehension beyond the texts. That's what troubles me. What troubles me is the seemingly self-exclusion of the world, the absorption of everything into the world of discourse, the world of words, the world of texts, and the lack of concern for those problems of human suffering and of threat to the world that occupy most of my waking energy.
The view that all there is text is an absurd view. I mean, you only have to hear it to hear that it's absurd. It certainly won't be a text if human beings exterminate themselves in the next half hour, as they perfectly pragmatically now could. Well, they wouldn't all be dead at the end of it, but they'd all be dead in the long run because of it. Now, what the radical insistence on textuality isn't, in any obvious sense, a help, as Ron Aronson was saying, isn't in any obvious sense a help in thinking about any of the major practical problems that face human beings politically, economically, and so on. Why is this skepticism of pseudo-authoritative discourse, of which, of course, there is a great deal, and I've no doubt I've been exhibiting some of it. Why is that going to help us in the face of those problems? That's what I would like to understand.
I would say that to identify text with verbal text is also, I'm sorry that the word text was used by the philosophers that we are talking about, but to an extent that is once again part of that vulnerability that I spoke of. There is a word that they use, a difficult word, paleonymy, that is to say the charge which words carry on their shoulders, so that perhaps it's better not to construct new words that seem clean. Text, in the way in which certainly Derrida and Lyotard understand it, text in that way is not at all the verbal text. When they read, there are two ways, once again, perhaps, of looking at this problem. When they read actual verbal objects that are political philosophy, philosophy tout court, history, whatever, they like to show that those things are also produced in language, because there is a tendency to forget that they're produced in language. There you may say that text is understood verbally. But when they talk about text, there is nothing but text, etc., they are talking about a network, a weave. You can put names on it: politico, psycho, sexual, socio, you name it. The moment you name it, there is a network that's broader than that. And to an extent, that notion that we are effects within a much larger text, tissue, weave, of which the ends are not accessible to us, is very different from saying that everything is language. And to an extent, if we are exterminated within the next 5 minutes, it will be a textual event, because it would not come about without the history that we are speaking of at great length here. And if that is not a text, nothing is. So from that point of view, the notion of text is one which has been domesticated into the verbal text, so that this can be understood as nothing more than another linguistic caper, but that's not what it is. So,
well, perhaps that's a point at which we can take a break. We shall be back in a moment. Welcome back. Before the break, Ron Aronson, you were suggesting, and indeed you suggest in your book, that there are some very urgent items on the political agenda, items which require objective analysis and firm programs for action, items, therefore, which seem altogether too urgent to wait upon this kind of theoretical skepticism that we've heard about in the first part of the program.
I suggest that the dangers ahead of us are somehow connected with the catastrophes that have happened before, the Holocaust, Stalinism, and so on, and that we do have the capacity for a reasonably objective analysis of those disasters and a reasonably objective analysis of the dangers, that we can look at what has happened very closely and carefully and try to understand and succeed in large measure at objectively understanding why, and that we can use these understandings to try to forestall the dangers that are ahead.
Can you tell us what this analysis is?
Yes. First of all, if you look at much of our century, in ordinary discourse, we would very commonly say, this has been mad. Nazism has been mad. Stalinism has been mad. The nuclear threat is mad. That there's been a gross irrationality at the heart of the 20th century. There still is today in political practice. And it seems to me that the best way to get to that gross irrationality and understand it is through social analysis, social structural analysis of the dynamics between classes in societies. So, for example, in Nazi Germany, in the Soviet Union, we can look at social classes whose conflicts were conditioned by the fact that they did not exist at the same moment in time, you might say. We're not synchronous. Social classes, that in some cases a social class was a class of the past exploding against the present. In another case, a social class might be viewed as a social class of the future, trying to drag the rest of the society into the future. Soviet Union. And that there are particular kinds of explosions which lend themselves to the 20th century for a whole variety of reasons. Also, in the case of the American war in Vietnam, or in the case of the nuclear threat, we can look at the displacement of social conflict onto technology, what I name in my book overdevelopment. It's a kind of displacement which gets out of hand as if one turns to the genie to solve social problems, a genie which is out of the bottle and won't come back in. Nuclear weapons. Now, this analysis is, at least I offer it as something that can be debated, something can be proven true or false, something that people might agree or disagree with, all on the terrain of objectivity.
But I wonder really whether, at this late stage of the 20th century, an essentially Marxist way of thinking about what is going on could turn out to be anything like sufficient for directing us on how we ought to act to try and diminish the probability of even worse things happening and improve the human quality of life in the societies which we inhabit, very different societies, as Gayatri pointed out earlier on, and all of them constituted by human beings in very different practical situations within themselves. And I'd just like to press you on one formula you used, which is speaking about social classes, the class of the past and the class of the future. Now, I take it what is politically central to Marxism is the belief that although human history before capitalism and in capitalism had to be socially oppressive to take place at all, that it no longer needs to be oppressive, and that what would, in Marxist terms, cause it to stop being oppressive would be the political triumph of the class of the future, the proletariat. And I must say, I think myself that that view was always a pretty incoherent and foolish view, and I don't really see how it's a seriously sustainable view in the face of the actual history of the 20th century.
Class struggle is an extremely important banner under which to mobilize. I want to get this said before I say what I'm going to say. If one looks at the way in which, for example, the United Steelworkers were used against Asian competitors during their recent strike, one sees that to universalize the working class under advanced capitalism in the 1980s as the proletariat is the kind of mistake that a post-structuralist reader simply would not allow. First of all, since, as I said in the first half, it is also a critique of phallocentrism, we would fix our glance on the fact that the notion of the proletariat itself is based on a certain kind of narrativization and exclusion. No one, in fact, possesses nothing but the object of his or her body but a woman. In fact, that is something that is completely undermined when one chooses to establish as the proletariat the man who sells his labor. To an extent, that's the point where we would fix our glance. We would also say that in terms of a feminist analysis, the notion of class struggle has suppressed a lot. Then we would say with all of the peasant movements all over the world that the idea of class struggle can sometimes be an imposition. And from that point of view, we would say that since in Marx himself, the notion of a post-revolutionary society is not articulate, especially in the later writings, that the notion, in fact, of a use-value society is extremely problematic. Those are the moments of doubt that a post-structuralist reader finds as moments of enablement. Since we are not looking for perfect analyses, but we are looking for the mark of vulnerability, which makes a great text not an authority generating a perfect narrative, but our own companion, as it were, so that we can share our own vulnerabilities with those texts and move. It seems to me that those are the places where we would begin to question. And there, if I can talk about the critique of the subject in Marx, it seems to me that that particular insight that the agent of history is not the individual as constituted by society, what we have seen in Marxism since then is a move toward collectivities as against the individual. the critique of the subject then has been understood in that way. At worst, it has become a party line. At best, it has become a genuine desire to mobilize. Whereas a post-structuralist reading would also say there is something on the other side of the individual. That is to say, not a collectivity which takes you to macrological solutions, which in the end do not lead to the ends that had been prescribed. But in fact, the subject has another side which is caught within the textuality of ideological or historical production. So we look at the female subject, at the subject in the margins of the periphery, the subject where you find it, really, in terms of its place of its constitution. And we wouldn't make the mistake of thinking that a worker in a Ford Motor Factory is tomorrow's proletariat. No, it exists within a certain kind of hegemonic ideological constitution, which it shares with the makers of the rationalist narrative. So I would say that in terms of the individual, post-structuralism would take you, with regard to Marx's critique of the subject, which comes out of Hegel, which comes out of Kant, post-structuralism would take you on the other side of the individual rather than to collectivities.
And if it did take one on the other side of the individual, what then would that imply for political thinking and political practice? What would one actually do, and how would one conceive of what one was doing?
Well, one would conceive of what one was doing according to the old rules. But in terms of how it would change one's practice, it would depend on, A, not believing that the formula for the good end would come if the program were adequately represented, because there is, in fact, no possibility of adequate representation of any narrative in practice.
John Donne, the very idea of an adequate political program is self-defeating?
Well, I think I'd like to comment a certain amount on both of those last two statements. Having got so far in intention, though no doubt not in achievement, as recognising the subjectivity of all the human beings are there, the question of what to do, I think, is going to depend very heavily on what you called the old rules. And I want to press ahead a little bit with the old rules, if I may, because I feel they haven't been getting as much of a run for their money as they might have done. Now, what I meant by speaking up a bit for the old rules is that it seems to me there were virtues in the Enlightenment project or the history of Western philosophy, which are still obviously virtues in relation to political practice. They may have done some mischief here and there, and insofar as they were in any way causally related, which probably shouldn't be exaggerated, to the invention of nuclear weapons, let alone to the, as it were, positioning of real nuclear weapons in real places aimed at real people. Of course, they have some very bad things to answer for. It might be terminally bad things to answer for. But I don't see myself a very intimate relation between the history in Western philosophy of attempts to understand why human natural scientific inquiry works where it does work. I don't see any very clear connection between that intellectual enterprise, which in a sense is given to us by the fact that it has worked insofar as it's worked, and it's puzzling to us why it should, and it's important to try to understand as well as one can why it does and doesn't. And certainly in relation to political practice, I think an insistence on the moral virtues of honesty, an insistence on the regulative role in human thinking of the rules of logic, and an insistence on trying to understand as soberly as one can why human knowing works where it does work and doesn't work where it doesn't work, is obviously a precondition for actually formulating well-considered political goals, and a precondition for cementing together the very motley coalition of human interests, as it were, every single member of which has, after all, their own subjectivity, together to move towards those goals.
I should think of that as a problem rather than a solution. It seems to me that what I was saying was not that you should consider all other subjects. I was saying that you might want to entertain the notion that you cannot consider all other subjects, and that you should look at your own subjective investment in the narrative that is being produced. You see, that is something that I will continue to repeat. It is not an invitation to be benevolent toward others, but...
Well, they certainly don't allow me to produce elegant solutions. I wish to God they did. But I think that you say that this modality of attempted political cooperation may conceal all sorts of dreadful things. My point is simply that it needn't. And the question of whether it does or whether it doesn't has to be answered, as it always has had to be answered in human history, by looking and seeing whether it does or not. And I simply think that it's a false claim, a result of an overestimation of the constraining force of rhetoric. It's a false claim that the project of attempting rationally to understand human societies commits people to any form of practical political cooperation in any determinate form of oppression. I see no such link.
But why should you not?
There may be contingent links in relation to particular people. The world's a confusing place, and people are often, in fact, involved in complicity in things which, if you pointed out to them clearly that they were, they would be pretty appalled by. But it doesn't seem to me that there's any connection at all between the project of trying to understand clearly and being committed to the doing of bad things. I simply reject the existence of any such link as a link of necessity. These are all contingent matters, and we must just look at them and make what sense we can.
Yes, I'm not suggesting some kind of reflection theory, isomorphic relationship between the project of rationalism and untold crimes committed all over the world. No, I'm suggesting that you extend your idea of looking and seeing to the rationalist project itself as you produce it, not as others might suffer from it. It is, as I will continue to say, it is an invitation for the investigating subject to see that the projects are produced within a much larger textuality. I don't see how one could possibly say that that is... And it also is true historically that there is at least something like a relationship. For this, you don't have to go to post-structuralism between the rationalist project as it has dissimulated, as it were, the history of territorial imperialism. We don't think of it as necessary, but we say that there is something like a relationship, very heterogeneous, different in different fields, but one must look and see constantly, and the rationalist project should not be free of that glance.
Well, of course it shouldn't be, but it, least of all projects, would ever have suggested that it should be free. I mean, the idea of self-understanding is one of the principal human goods as conceived within the rationalist project. So insofar as the rationalist project has concretely, historically been associated with and in practice traduced by and deformed by complicity in the doing of bad things, it has betrayed itself.
But the idea has failed because it has not acknowledged that self-understanding is impossible. That has been the problem.
Supposing we acknowledge that self-understanding is possible, what should we do politically on the basis of that insight?
Well, precisely what I've been suggesting. I think, first of all, that the Western theoretical establishment should take a moratorium on producing global solutions. It seems to me that we have been talking about, and this is why the critique of Western metaphysics is so important as a critique of Western metaphysics in the post-structuralists. I think in the language of commercials, one would say, try it, you might like it. Try to behave as if you are part of the margin. Try to unlearn your privilege. This, I think, would be a lesson that one could draw in a very crude way from the post-structuralist enterprise.
Well, it sounds spiritually very edifying, but I'm not clear from anything you've said that it's going to be cognitively particularly helpful. And I simply don't think it is true, actually, that the Western intellectual establishment, whatever it is full of global solutions at the moment. It seems to me to be running for cover as hard as it can go.
But Ron, you have a solution which, if not exactly global, is fairly large in scale. As you listen to this conversation, what implications do you think it has for what you talked about?
When John talks about the Enlightenment, and I think of Marxism, I think of it as certainly one of the children of the Enlightenment. and everything he's been saying about the Enlightenment thought and I think especially the obligation for self-criticism has been a driving force in a great deal of Marxist creative work that's being done in the last, certainly the last 25 years and beyond that. The critical reflection on what went wrong, where it went wrong, why, what lenses were misapplied, what lenses were used wrongly, what assumptions were incorrect. That's part of, I think, the continuing intellectual power of Marxism as a way of looking at reality, is this ability of critiquing itself and the continuing effort to do so. I think that there are probably very few non-party related Marxists today, let's say in Great Britain and the United States, who would, as you would say, privilege the working class the way you were talking a few minutes ago. Rather, we've seen what? Since the latter part of the 19th century, the development of imperialism, even before that, forms of enslavement, various forms of racism, colonialism, imperialism, the explosions of the 20th century, the rise of the women's movement, the assault on racism, we see, in other words, in what is increasingly a worldwide system, various layers of oppression, very different ones, various forms of struggle, which people have been wrestling with to grasp the intelligibility of, and which it seems to me one can begin to chart an overall intelligibility of. It's not, it seems to me it's not a matter of throwing up one's hands and saying all of these are localized and different, but rather there is still, what should we say, a worldwide order which is generating these various phenomena in different sectors. Now, it seems to me if we look on this history and go back far enough and come into the present, we have, if the nuclear clock does not run to midnight, if that does not happen, rather than a negative outlook, rather than a despairing vision of our prospects, it seems to be we might be able to have a much more positive one, because we can see that these struggles continue to have been generated, going back at least to Spartacus, and that people continue to struggle and will continue to struggle for dignity, for a decent life, for power, for freedom, for democracy, for their own integrity. And I can't see a stopping point to those struggles until they're won.
In a way, he's turning the argument of the deconstructionists back on itself and saying that there is indeed a grand récit to be told, a story to be recounted, a cumulative story, a story which gives one a stronger and stronger sense of these movements emerging and from time to time coming to power, and even if they fail in the power they acquire, nevertheless leaving a lesson behind them.
To an extent, I think the post-structuralist project would look at history not as a series of brute facts, but as narratives generated in one way or another. Derrida has a statement where he says that deconstruction is the deconstitution of the founding concepts of the Western historical narrative. And, you know, a small point which can very easily be misunderstood, that in Ron's narrative, the history of resistance begins with Spartacus. You know, one,
I said at least.
At least. Okay, the apology made, but nonetheless, there it is. There is something that we would think about there. The point is not to recover a lost consciousness, but to see, to quote Macheret, the itinerary of the silencing. You see, that's what one looks at. So from that point of view, our view of history is a very different view. It is also cumulative, but it's a view where we see the way in which narratives compete with each other, which one rises, which one falls, who is silenced, and the itinerary of the silencing rather than retrieval. And we also see that we are ourselves bound to narrate, which is why I quoted Lyotard's narrative in La Condition Postmoderne, so that one shouldn't think that we are somehow outside waging war.
If we were doing that kind of narrative in the United States, and we were to ask the question, who built the railroads in a classroom, for example, one of the first answers students might give would be the Rockefellers or the Harrimans. And then with a bit of prodding, someone might say, well, the Irish or the Chinese. And one would go through that process of starting out with the established vision, the dominant vision of how history was produced, to a vision of history being produced rather differently. But at the end of that discussion, people might walk away saying, well, now I understand who really built the railroads. It seems to me that conclusion is not a conclusion that your approach would allow.
Because they didn't really build the railroads either. The Rockefellers built it too. You see, so that to an extent, what one...
But are you willing to then analyze the building of the railroads in terms of the various forces of capital and labor and technology and say, we can finally decide, to the best of our knowledge, reasonably objectively, that the building of the railroads took place in the following ways, and lay out the various relationships between the various forces and come up with an objective interpretation?
Well, this is the only narrative we can construct, is what we can say. I mean, that is what, in fact, allows us to understand that we are working within limits, instead of saying it's an objective analysis.
But are you willing to say this is the fullest possible, the most adequate narrative? You see, I'm pushing you on the question of objectivity.
At the moment.
At the moment. At the moment.
At the moment.
Well, of course, I would agree with that.
You know, the question that Mary O'Brien asks, as you're being a critic by day and a fisherman by night, I forget quite what the day-night breakdown there is, who's minding the babies? You see, so to an extent, there's always that further question, even those, you know, so that one doesn't know, one shouldn't want to close off discussion. One should be able to say, look, I'm putting my interests scrupulously on the table. This is what we can do at the moment, but, you know, there you are. It seems to me there's no debate there, is there?
Well, one certainly shouldn't try to close off discussion. That's a very good rationalist Enlightenment principle. But I think probably we are still in some fairly strong disagreement about one matter, which anyway concerns us as educators, if not necessarily from other points of view, which is that you say the great texts of the past are texts which speak to us because of what they shy away from or leave out. And I think from my point of view, my belief is still that the great texts of the past should speak to us because of the passages of cognitive mastery which they contain. That the heritage of the accumulated intellectual, rationally reconsidered heritage of the history of the human race is all we have with which to think about where we find ourselves. And that the idea of deciding to stop using that or becoming paralyzed in our attempts to use it, because it's a hard business getting anywhere if you use it as vigorously as you can dare to. The idea that one should accept that persuasion because one may well be wrong is not actually politically at all a benign persuasion. We may be wrong about very many matters. Actually, if you look at us soberly and historically and cumulatively, we must be wrong. Humans always get things wrong. But the idea that we shouldn't try to draw as systematically as we can on human thinking in its most systematic elements, because that may have got, and must have got, in fact, and certainly did get, tangled up with the history of human oppression, that is not actually an educationally benign persuasion. About that, I think we really do genuinely, at last, disagree.
I hope so. I would say that as a teacher, it seems to me that even as we work with, we all teach within certain kinds of institutions that have a certain sort of contact. So here, when I say, let us not close off discussion, I'm not forgetting that earlier I had said that certain regimes of truth will not allow people to enter, or we can't even hear them. So I'm now speaking as your colleague. It seems to me that in that kind of a situation, the fact that the best tools that we seem to have are those tools of rational thinking does not stop us from saying that they might be symptomatic rather than, as I said earlier, the Union ticket to truth. I think there is no harm in that, especially since in these kinds of academic institutions, as I also said earlier, what is being produced is perhaps we might think they're just benign and they're just disinterested knowledge, but what is being produced is cultural explanations that silence others. And in terms of that mutism, for example, I have said in another context about feminism that perhaps rather than asking the question, what is woman, because that, or what am I, which would be simply reiterating the question of what is man, since all we have, as you said, is this historical account, perhaps the proper question for someone who has not been allowed to be the subject of history is to say, what is man that he was obliged to produce such a text of history? So to an extent, I agree that is all we have. But
well,
it seems to me
that's quite a Marxist question, isn't it?
That,
yes.
To an extent, all I'm suggesting is that one turn back on history as a production of various kinds of narratives, and that one then not offer the idea that there will be an objective analysis which will then be an end of narrativization, because one is also caught within narrating oneself.
But even modern philosophers of natural science don't think there's going to be an objective analysis which will be the end of narration. I mean, nobody really thinks that any longer. And what I think we do still disagree about is you say that any human cognitive project will terminate in a cultural explanation which silences others. And my view is that that is only true insofar as any particular human cognitive project ends up in an invalid set of conclusions.
I wasn't speaking of any human cognitive project. Once again, I was saying, I was very careful in establishing the fact that we are talking within certain kinds of institutional constraints. We have been trained to teach at certain kinds of institutions. That is where we teach. I even allowed myself the pleasure of saying that I was speaking as your colleague. Within that particular frame, it seems to me, out of the theoretical production in the first world comes the cultural explanations that I'm speaking of. So it's, once again, it's not a generalized statement, although I did say that the pleasure in cognition, and there Lyotard goes back to Kant, the pleasure Foucault does too, the pleasure in cognitive victories, if understood as symptomatic, can be enabling rather than disabling. And if it is disabling, it is not a disablement that one should shy away from.
One shouldn't close off discussions, certainly, but we do live and work within an institutional context, including the context of the programme, and I'm afraid that this particular discussion will stop, but at least I hope that it's been an enabling one. Thank you all very much.